How to kill a knight with a katana? Or how would a knight use a katana to kill another knight? I am Tim, an armored fighter in non-choreographed knight fights. This is a Raichu Okatana made by Akado Armory. This Okatana is 136 centimeters long, so a little bit more than 53 inches. This Okatana is made for sparring, for safe sparring. So the blade is blunt and it is possible to use it safe in training. And the most important part is that the blade can flex. But there are a couple of more features with this blade. Akado Armory offers to make a traditional handle wrap, but they also offer to make a layer of epoxy over the handle wrap, so it will not come loose after a couple of uses. The most interesting part of the katanas of Akado Armory is that they fit into a scabbard. So, how to kill a knight with a Okatana or Tachi? The best expert for killing knights is, of course, another knight. So let's ask first, how would a knight use an Okatana or Tachi to kill another knight? Most techniques will be, of course, thrusting to the opponent's gaps, sometimes cutting, often to deflect strikes or to move the blade in a position where you can thrust to the opponent's gaps. Of course, if your opponent haven't full armor and use some unarmored or lower armored parts, it can be a good idea to strike. Most attacks in knight-to-knight fights are not cutting. Most attacks when a knight fight another knight with a longsword are thrusts. Of course, with this blade you can also thrust in the opponent's gaps. There is, of course, one technique that is very special for the European fighting style with longswords in armored combat: the half sword. When you use a Tachi or Okatana with a very long blade, it can be more important to use this grip. Because with a longer blade, it is harder to aim for a weak spot with two hands on the handle and the point far away from your hands. So it will be harder to aim for a gap this way than aiming for a gap this way. A longsword is normally a multi-tool in use against other knights' armors. So there isn't only the edge and the point at the end. There is normally also a crossguard with two spikes or thickened ends. And of course the pommel at the other side. So there are techniques like Mordschlag where you use normally the crossguard to puncture a weak point in armor. This is, of course, not possible with a katana, but this design of a disc at the cross is nothing new for a knight. The rondel dagger of a knight also uses two discs at the cross and of the end of the handle. There is a purpose for this, because a knight normally wears full protected gloves, where there's only 2 entry points into the hand. So if you hold something with the gauntlet, it is possible to step in here and here. And these discs will prevent an opponent blade from getting into these weak points. An Okatana will have the same options to protect your hand. Having no pommel at the end of the katana isn't a big problem. Of course, it can be helpful on the wrap of a longsword to have a pommel at the end to secure the hand inside of the handle and have a counterbalance on the blade. But in this case, I have to say that this Okatana feels not that front heavy. The longer handle on this blade with the metal core inside make it feel very light and nimble in the hands. So the longer handle makes the same feeling of having a pommel at the end. Of course, with the kashira at the end of the Okatana, you don't have the same force like with the pommel of a longsword when you try to strike to the opponent's head or helmet. But I don't think that this is big of a deal, because most strikes with the pommel to a helmet are even not a big deal with the European longsword. It don't hurt so much that you can cause significant damage or concussions to your opponent. So don't have this option in a real fight isn't a big problem. Of course, you can't use the cross guard in a Mordschlag. But even this is a technique that you didn't see that often in historical duels used against an armored opponent, because it is a huge risk to grab the blade at the other end. With a katana it would be a smaller risk, because there is a blunt edge, so it is much easier and safer to grab the blade. But there is of course no significant weapon at this side. But this isn't a big deal. The Mordschlag is a very rare technique, even in European longsword armored combat. To block the attacks of an opponent, a knight normally uses a longsword to bind the blade of the opponent. So a strike comes down to the crossguard where it is blocked in a way so that the knight can counterattack. This is not possible with an Okatana, where there is no big crossguard and the backside of the blade is blunt even on historical blades. So you have to use another way to block the strikes of an opponent, and you have to deflect these strikes so that the opponent's attack will slide downwards and leave the blade at the other end. It is also possible to deflect strikes, and a curved edge will make this easier because it feels like a hook when you catch the opponent's blade with the back, and you can come back with a strike or thrust. So there are of course more deflections where you try to let the blade of the opponent slide on your blade, and you try to strike the opponent's blade out of the way with the curve of the katana. This feels very, very nice. And there are of course historical techniques with longswords where you try to bind the blade and strike it out of the way. So this is of course a technique that a knight would normally use. Single-edged curved swords are absolutely present in medieval Europe. So it will not be the biggest problem for a knight to use a katana to his advantage. So, how would a knight use a katana to kill another knight? An Okatana or Tachi is of course one of the best cutting swords that you can use. So if you want to try to kill a knight, you have to look for parts of his armor where you can cut. So it is possible to cut here, and sometimes it is possible to cut inside in the back of the leg in a perfect angle where it is possible to cut without getting caught by the leaf of the knee plate. These are normally the only two spots where it is possible to cut a knight. So how about thrusts? Many strikes with a katana are for deflecting the blade and then step in with a thrust into the helmet of a samurai. The same can apply at the knight helmets. Of course, not at my helmet, with only these small holes, but there are many knightly helmets where you have visor slits. So it is of course possible to thrust in these gaps, but the shape of the katana blade, it wouldn't be that pointy like longsword tips. There is a significant difference between the blade tip of European weapons and katanas. So normally you have to turn the blade in the perfect angle to thrust with the shape of the sight to go into the visor.
Nice.
It is possible to thrust here in the male part, but the point having the perfect shape to burst through the rings, and the tip shape made it necessary to pierce more than one ring. So you have to pierce a couple of rings to dig deep in the body of the knight. Thrusting through mail with a katana is very, very hard. It isn't of course impossible to kill a knight with the Okatana. It's a heavy blade, so it's of course possible to pierce a male part, but not that deep. So you can injure him a couple of times. And if you are very lucky with a thrust to the visor or in a small gap between plates, you maybe can kill him. Your best option is of course to go for the legs. Even when male is here in these places, it is possible to thrust in a low stance where the curve of the blade can get under the mail. This blade and tip is for fighting light armored infantry or an opponent with a few more gaps in his armor. And therefore this blade is of course one of the best blades I ever used. But I don't think that the purpose of a Okatana or a Tachi is to defeat heavy armored knights. So what would a samurai do to defeat a knight when he sees that there are no gaps in the visor? that there are no gaps under the arm, and maybe even the inside of the legs is protected by mail armor. There is one option where the katana is even better than a long sword. And this part is ringen or wrestling. This handle feels like the shaft of a pole weapon. If a samurai tries to fight a knight and there are not a few gaps where it is possible to thrust in with the katana, I think the samurai will try to go into grappling, to use this lever to bring the knight on the ground, and then try to open up his visor or find a new gap where he can, of course, use half swording and shorten the blade of the Okatana. There are even some European techniques where you use the blade in a very strong grip at the tip and try to push in the gaps of armor with only this small part of the blade. So, what are my final thoughts on this weapon? The first thing is, of course, that this blade looks absolutely fantastic. It feels good and I like it. But of course, to use it against a knight, it's maybe not the best weapon. Then, thanks for watching, stay safe and don't kill your training partners.